You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 320, recorded on August 9th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And on the line from D.C. is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bill.
So this week we have a bit of a lighter episode. We're just going to be doing sort of a roundup on some of the stuff that was happening a century ago in 1920 that we thought were notable things worthy of some further discussion. As folks may remember, earlier in the year when the pandemic started, we did do an episode on the Spanish flu, so we're not going to recap that. But we will go to March 1920 to talk about the Treaty of Versailles. That's something that it's been argued in some places that the flu may have affected some of the participants of the conference that was negotiating the Treaty of Versailles in the first place, including possibly even the President of the United States, and that this may have affected some of the contents of the final terms of the treaty. But in March 1920, the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. We did sort of allude to a little bit of this in our recent episode where we talked about Vice President Thomas Marshall, who was, as Vice President of the United States, he was the President of the Senate. In that capacity, he repeatedly tried to get the Wilson administration to understand some of the compromises that they were going to need to make in order to get something passed. They were not really willing to do that. However, that also gets into the broader issue of Wilson having a stroke and so forth, which is not really what we're talking about as much today. So, Kelley, let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles, the process that led to that, and sort of what the objections of the U.S. Senate were that led to it not being ratified.
Sure, Bill. And of course, Bill mentioned this being a lighter episode, but this probably falls on the side of things that are not so light that happened in 1920. What we're going to mostly be talking about today is that in March of 1920, the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to end World War I. And naturally, in order to figure out what happened in March 1920, we need to go back a little ways and try to figure out how the treaty was developed. And of course, the Treaty of Versailles had been negotiated as an end to World War I. And Wilson, who was president at the time, was sort of a famous academic, had been president of Princeton University, and he really approached the development of the Treaty of Versailles as an academic. He laid out his 14-point plan. He brought other academics with him to negotiate this treaty, and he really sort of approached it as an intellectual pursuit. Of course, like his vice president and others pointed out, this wasn't purely an intellectual pursuit, because eventually he would have to come back to the U.S. Congress with this treaty, and it would have to be ratified by a 2/3 majority in the Senate. To complicate matters, Wilson, who was a Democrat, and the Republicans had won a majority in the Congress in 1918, so it probably would have behooved him to think about that as he approached these negotiations, but alas, he did not, and continued in his sort of stereotypical academic way, and did not bring any Republicans with him to negotiate this treaty. So he gets this treaty that really reflects a lot of his values, a lot of his ideas, and his 14 points, and essentially an end to the war without victory. He did not want to set up a situation where all the spoils went to the victors and we ended up in the cycle of war. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and he was committed to sort of leading that charge. So he ends up with a treaty that reflects a lot of his values, and this is probably most notable and most significant when it comes to the League of Nations, which of course was the precursor to the United Nations, and which was the first intergovernmental body specifically dedicated to the pursuit of world peace. Not totally an economic body, not totally a trade organization, but really was established for the purpose of establishing world peace. So, of course, the idea of the League of Nations gets built into the Treaty of Versailles. The Covenant of the League of Nations was signed on June 28, 1919, by parties at the Treaty of Versailles, and Woodrow Wilson actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for the idea in 1919, which just goes to show you sort of that this was his brainchild, and he really fought hard for this in Versailles. The beginning of the Covenant of the League of Nations read, "The high contracting parties, in order to promote international cooperation and to achieve international peace and security, by the acceptance of obligations not to resort to war, by the prescription of open, just, and honorable relations between nations, and by the firm establishment of the understandings of the international law as the actual rule of conduct among governments, and by the maintenance of justice and scrupulous respect for all treaty obligations in the dealings of organized peoples with one another, agreed to the Covenant of the League of Nations. So this was clearly a very aspirational pursuit, with the idea being that the League of Nations could prevent war by establishing a collective security, by disarming as much as possible, and by having an international body for dispute resolution and arbitration. And we see many of these ideas still reflected in the United Nations today, but this was really the first go of it. So Wilson, in many ways, sort of gets his way in 1919. The treaty looks like he wants it to, and then he returns to the United States to get it ratified by the Senate. In the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, opposition to the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles at large was a Republican from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge. He had philosophical disagreements with the law, which we will discuss, but he also had just a deep personal distaste for President Wilson and what he sort of perceived to be like an academic superiority, and was likely sort of ticked off by the fact that none of his party members had been included in the development of this treaty. But now that they had the Republicans had the majority of Congress, they were going to be required to ratify it. And so Lodge came up with the 14 reservations in opposition to Wilson's 14 points. And his greatest concern really was about Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which read, "The members of the League undertake to respect and preserve, as against external aggression, the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. In case of any such aggression, or in case of any threat or danger of such aggression, the Council shall advise upon the means by which this obligation shall be fulfilled." So Lodge's interpretation of this, not necessarily wrong, took this to mean that the United States would have to go to war on behalf of other nations in the League. Like Bill was mentioning before we started, and I'm sure he'll go into it, that there were other wars going on in the time. There was still a lot of conflict in the world, and so Lodge was concerned that we were just going to have to sort of blindly, follow the directions of the League and either engage in or step out of military conflicts based on the sort of will of this League of Nations. Another sort of interesting take on this was Lodge's issue with the constitutionality of this agreement, that at the time, in the good old days, Congress would actually approve each military intervention. And so he felt that the Senate couldn't just make an open-ended commitment like this to get involved whenever the League said that we should get involved. And so Lodge, he famously wrote, and this is where I start to see a lot of similarities to some of the feelings today about international bodies, including the UN and the WHO and other organizations which are geared to sort of get us to cooperate on the world stage. Lodge wrote, "The United States is the world's best hope. But if you fetter her in the interests and quarrels of other nations, if you tangle her in the intrigues of Europe, you will destroy her power for good and endanger her very existence. Leave her to march freely through the centuries to come, as in the years that have gone. Strong, generous, and confident, she has nobly served mankind. Beware how you trifle with your marvelous inheritance, this great land of ordered liberty, for if we stumble and fall, freedom and civilization everywhere will go down in ruin." So a passage that shows sort of an incredible belief in American exceptionalism, and he really felt that the United States should sort of charge ahead without getting entangled in this League. And so I think one thing that I spent a little bit of time reading about, because I think in history class we'll often read about sort of the charge of Lodge and the conflict that existed between him and Wilson. But Henry Cabot Lodge actually did want to sign the Treaty of Versailles. He just wanted to do some of these reservations. And so he was sort of the leader of the group of reservationists who did want to pass the treaty, but not exactly as Wilson had laid it out. And there was another group in the Senate deemed the irreconcilables, who had no interest in the Treaty of Versailles, despite the changes that may come to it. And so what had to happen, but didn't happen, was that Wilson and his supporters were going to have to compromise with the reservationists, and those two blocs would have to agree in order to get the necessary 2/3 majority in the Senate. Of course, that did not happen. That didn't for both philosophical reasons and some of the political reasons we've touched upon. So on November 19th, 1919, the Senate voted on the treaty with the 14 lodge reservations that he had laid out. But Wilson told his supporters to vote against the version because he was holding out for ratification of the treaty without these reservations. And so that treaty with reservations fell by a 2/3 majority with a final 55-39 vote. And that was both Wilson's followers and the irreconcilables voting against it. And so when the second vote came without the reservations, it sort of ended similarly with a 53-38 vote, this time with the irreconcilables and the Cabot Republicans forming the opposition. So the vote of on March 19th, 1920, with the reservations, was sort of the final vote of the treaty. They had gone back and forth. No compromises have been made. It had lasted about 6 months at that point. On March 20th, the New York Times reported, after the session ended, senators of both parties united in declaring that, in their opinion, the treaty was now dead and to stay dead. So there was simply no compromise to be had. The United States would not sign the Treaty of Versailles. The United States would not join the League of Nations. At this point, the League of Nations had already started meeting without the United States. And at its strength, in the 1930s, they would have about 50 members. So they had sort of begun and would do so without the United States. I think interestingly, it's sort of clear to see that this debate sort of cost Wilson his health. In the fall of 1919, he went on a 22-day train journey to convince the American people of the merits of his plan, but he was sort of famously exhausted and worn thin the whole time, and he actually even collapsed in Colorado from exhaustion. He returned to Washington, and he had a near-fatal stroke. He would recover and continue to campaign for the treaty, but to no avail, and it would not pass. And essentially, the resolution of this was, and the resolution of the First World War was that, in the United States anyway, was that Harding, the Republican Harding, became president, and Congress passed the Knox-Porter Resolution in 1921, which effectively ended their involvement in World War I, even though the war had been over for a while, and they would never sign the Treaty of Versailles. And so the United States has sort of found this alternate way out through the Knox-Porter Resolution, and the League continued to meet as the first worldwide intergovernmental organization whose purpose was to maintain peace. 26 years later, after World War II, which it did not successfully avert, obviously, it would be replaced by the United Nations, which the United States would join. I think that there are a lot of similarities in the story between the League of Nations and the conversations we're currently having in the United States about, and have always had in the United States, about the appropriate place for the United States on the world stage. I've reading through some of Henry Cabot Lodge's speeches and writings, it is clear that he thought that the United States was the natural leader of the world and would do so whether or not it was involved with other countries in these sort of formal diplomatic settings. And Stuart M. Patrick, who's a director at the Council of Foreign Affairs, was asked about parallels between the League of Nations and today. And he says, in many ways, debates going on now are a total throwback to debates over the U.S. role in the world following World War I. In some ways, Trump, in my view, has a pre-1941 mindset. He'd be quite comfortable going back to that era in which the U.S. didn't have to exercise these global responsibilities. Contexts are always different, though there's that saying, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And so I think that it's interesting to see 100 years later to the day, these conversations play out as we look at our role in the global pandemic and what the right way is to cooperate or not cooperate with other nations in order to address that situation. So obviously quite a different situation, but lots of parallels between concerns about the politics and the constitutionality and the philosophy of the United States getting involved in these intergovernmental groups.
Thanks, Kelley. I don't necessarily completely agree with the quote from the Council on Foreign Relations guide, but I will say that, as you say, the pandemic puts that in a little bit of a different light, because it's not necessarily the question of the United Nations as a whole or military intervention. Sometimes it's just as simple as, are we part of the World Health Organization? And the sort of unwillingness and reluctance among some American leaders, including currently the president, to be involved with an international organization because, well, it might make the United States look bad. I can definitely see some parallels there. But as you've sort of alluded to, there were some, even if you set aside sort of the American exceptionalism of Henry Cabot Lodge, just as we might, for the purposes of this discussion, set aside the obvious inherent conflict between Wilson's international liberalism and anti-colonialism versus his white supremacist views domestically that we talked about on the episode about Vice President Thomas Marshall. There were some points that you can see where the opponents were coming from on this that they weren't necessarily wrong. There are some procedural questions that are of interest, as Kelley alluded to. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, there's a couple of lines about treaties that specifically, I think, raise interesting questions. One of them is sort of a question of interpretation that I remember a professor of international relations at University of Delaware was the first person who, brought that to my attention during some lecture. Is in Article 6, it sort of implies that it is impossible for a treaty ratified by the Senate to be unconstitutional because it is on the same level as the Constitution, if not overriding the Constitution. That one says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." And the way it's written is always confusing in terms of the punctuation, because the Constitution is very poorly written from a punctuation standpoint, and some stuff has changed since then. But it is possible to interpret that as saying that the Constitution and all treaties made shall be the supreme law of the land, meaning they're on at least equal footing. Lodge obviously didn't see it that way. But the other thing that I think gets to something that Kelley addressed more directly is just Article 2, Section 2, referring to presidential powers, says he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Now, the by and with the advice and consent of the Senate is a kind of wacko line that John Adams came up with for the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, and that has created all kinds of problems both in the Massachusetts Constitution and in the U.S. Constitution. But just as Kelley said, from a raw political standpoint, look, if I were writing the Constitution as a framer, I wouldn't have written it this way for how you come up with treaties, obviously, right? They were originally thinking there were 26 senators and that the president, you would send a delegation to go negotiate something and you'd come back with it, and then the Senate would, either give it an up or down vote because, it's hard to negotiate things in the 18th century. It'd take years and there was long travel times and for messages and negotiators and so forth. But when we're talking about in 1920, yeah, he probably didn't want to send cables back and forth necessarily with potential security risks about the negotiations. But why wouldn't you bring Republican negotiators representing the Senate majority, right? I mean, I think that's what you were kind of alluding to, Kelley. Am I correct in that? It's just bizarre. That you're going to need to get to those 67 votes. Why would you not bring probably representatives of both parties?
Yeah, it very much seemed like a stubborn, sort of boneheaded move, and I think is sort of illustrious of what we've talked about previously with Wilson sort of being unable to accept sort of the rules of politics and of governance.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is about this, again, you need, well, I guess I said 67. It wouldn't have been 67 votes because I think there were fewer senators at the time, but 2/3 today would be 67, so that's why I said that. Anyway, so you need a 2/3 vote in the Senate for ratification. So from a practical standpoint, he probably should have brought people along. I think also, like, the conference at Versailles and the various treaties that came out of that, not just the Treaty of Versailles, but also the Treaty of Trianon, the treaties that tried to deal with Turkey, the treaties that dealt with some of the various Central European states and so forth. This was like a very, very complicated process. I don't really like the outcome of most of it. I think most of the treaties were pretty terribly written and just bad in general. But I think if he had brought negotiators with him from the other party, they would have at least seen firsthand like what a huge nightmare it was to try to deal with this and how complicated it was and how the other countries were reacting and so forth. Like, maybe that would have gotten him a little bit better results back home, because they could have gone back and said, like, look, this is the deal that we got, and maybe it was the best deal that we could have gotten, that kind of thing. Or maybe not. Maybe they would have negotiated specific details. But either way, just practicality, it seems odd that he didn't do that. As you said, though, also the bigger thing that I feel like doesn't get enough attention, and I mean, I'm sure that probably it has come up in like exhaustive histories of the peace conference, but in terms of like sort of the popular history or the APUS history level, like breezing through the, and then Henry Cabot Lodge and the reservationists blocked the Treaty of Versailles. I don't think they talk enough about the fact that of how many conflicts were ongoing during the conference and even during the ratification debates in the U.S. Senate. And, the United States had entered the war pretty reluctantly to begin with and was pretty eager to bounce as soon as the armistice rolled around in 1918, in November of 1918. And then at that point, the conference took so long that by the time they had sort of finished coming up with like the terms and got it to the U.S. Senate to debate ratification in the first part of 1920, like that had been well over a year that peace had essentially been established. I would be very wary too if I were leaning against like constant, U.S. military interventions around the world as to my level of involvement and continued involvement. So just to sort of like recap a few of the conflicts that had happened either during the armistice period or were happening during the ratification debate in the United States. The biggest one, obviously, the Russian Civil War. That didn't end until 1923, but in fact, U.S. troops were not withdrawn from the Soviet Union until April of 1920, after the failure of the U.S. Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. That was a potentially very embroiling situation where the United States could have just found itself getting drawn deeper and deeper in, and you could see why maybe some of the less interventionist, senators would have been a little bit reluctant to ratify something that they felt might potentially obligate them to continue getting involved. Previously in 1919, which this had only wrapped up, less than half a year earlier, basically, or maybe about half a year earlier, was the conflict in Hungary and with all of Hungary's neighbors. So after Hungary broke away from the Austria-Hungary Empire and lost its holdings in Croatia, there was a conflict over the exact borders of Hungary, because the Kingdom of Hungary historically, since the Middle Ages, had encompassed a pretty broad area that wasn't necessarily all Hungarian nationals. They had a simultaneous multi-front war conflict, including a Bolshevik revolution in Hungary, backed by the nationalists who thought that arming the workers and having a workers' revolutionary military operation might be the only way to save a national Hungary within some of its larger borders. They had a multi-front war with Czechoslovakia over the border, with Romania over the border regarding Transylvania. There was a conflict over the borders with what became Yugoslavia, the basically the Serbian kingdom that took over most of the South Slavic territories of Croatia and Bosnia that had been in the Austria-Hungary Empire, and that was a very violent conflict that the French were sort of involved in, and that could have potentially dragged the United States in had that continued. This would have been the kind of thing that I think would have been on the minds of a lot of the decision makers at the time, whether or not it was wrapped up at that point. The other huge one that was going on, which I feel like gets almost zero attention in the popular histories of the immediate post-World War I period, was the Turkish War of Independence. So this was a struggle that involved most of the Allied troops, certainly the British and the French, as well as the Greek forces. And this was a struggle because the Ottoman leadership, such as it still was at the end of the war, was willing to make some pretty significant concessions to the Allies from a position of weakness and near total collapse to give pretty huge territories away, not just in the Middle Eastern territories that were given away, but also giving away significant land on the Anatolian side to Greece that did have significant Greek populations. But the Turkish nationalists and the Young Turks movement and Ataturk and all that were not willing to settle for that. And so there was this breakaway faction that declared itself to be this new government of Turkey rather than the Ottoman government, and that they were not going to be bound by any treaties that were negotiated. And so all those negotiations that had happened at the peace conference went out the window, and they proceeded to fight a multi-front war to establish the borders of what is today Turkey, or more or less the modern borders of Turkey. And so again, that's another thing where you could see, like, if you were, and that was still ongoing as well during this time period, and certainly through 1920. This is something that you would have been thinking about if you were like, well, that, you know, we already know that the World War I wasn't the war to end all wars. And sure, you could argue, well, this is just little wars that are sort of wrapping up and finalizing the national borders once and for all, so that there's never any conflict. But like you also look at the situation with the ongoing wars between the Polish and the Soviets, the wars around Ukraine. There was just so much ongoing conflict over where the borders were going to be, and this probably dawning realization that actually this notion of self-determination was really not as neat and tidy as people had maybe thought that it was, or as people like Wilson had sort of implied that it was. There were referenda happening in mixed German areas, with, I think, with regard to the Danish border, with regard to the Polish border. You had areas even that had plurality Polish people that were voting to remain in Germany because they would rather be in Germany than Poland at the time, at least. This is the kind of thing that proved the realities were so much more complicated than the vision of the world that had been presented by Wilson in the run-up to the armistice. And the treaty conference was certainly proving that this was not going to be an easy task. And you could already essentially see the writing on the wall that there was potentially going to be some very serious ongoing conflicts for an indefinite period of time, even if you didn't see the writing on the wall in terms of World War II. Not to mention that John Maynard Keynes is rolling out his smash hit book on the consequences of the peace, where he was saying that this was going to basically buy 20 years of peace, and then they were going to kick off again with another significant war. That had come out in 1919. He was essentially proven correct on that point, because that is what ended up transpiring, leading to World War II. But even if you didn't buy into the notion that there was going to be another huge sweeping cataclysmic war, just the sheer number of little wars all over the place, I think probably had to put a lot of people on edge in terms of wanting to make those commitments, which I don't think is exactly the same as isolationism, because, to go back to that Council on Foreign Relations quote that I didn't really agree with, the implication there is like, and this has been the standard narrative since the end of World War II, is that the big mistake that the United States made was wanting to be isolationist between World War I and World War II. But like, this is what I'm saying, is look at the situation that was happening. You can see why maybe there would have been some reluctance to get involved. Not to mention that I personally believe the United States didn't need to and shouldn't have gotten involved in World War I at all, but that's sort of a separate topic for another day. Kelley, I was wondering what you thought about the stuff that I just talked about.
I agree with what you just talked about. I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about those angles, but I think it just goes to show you sort of the power of zooming into a certain day or a certain year. I mean, March 19th, 1920 was the day the United States finally said we're not ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, but there were all these other existing conflicts in the world. And I think that, you could probably make an argument one way or the other on whether Henry Cabot Lodge was on the right side of history, but the truth is that the United States not joining the League of Nations sort of did set in motion the events that would happen in the decades to follow. So I think it's interesting to reflect on the sentiments that led to that decision, and how they still very much exist, for worse or for better in our country today.
All right, so we're going to move on to Rachel now to talk about something related to the post office that we didn't have time to talk about on last week's episode that was specifically about the post office. So Rachel, could you fill us in on a momentous decision made by the post office in 1920?
Yeah, so June 14th, 1920, the first Assistant Postmaster General Coons made a ruling that children clearly did not come within the classification of harmless live animals, which do not require food or water while in transit, which I think was the loophole that a lot of people were using to mail children. So in 1913, parcel post was introduced to the post office, or the post office department, and it allowed millions of Americans to access goods and services through the mail. But there were some unintended consequences, because parcel post was a lot cheaper than train tickets. So a lot of parents just kind of started mailing their children to like grandparents and other relatives because it was so much cheaper to send their children that way. A baby got sent in Ohio via parcel post, and it only cost 15 cents in postage. However, there's a footnote in this Smithsonian Magazine article that they did insure him for $50. So it wasn't just the cost of postage to send children. There's an Idaho connection. In February of 1914, a 4-year-old girl named Charlotte May Piersdorf was mailed via train from Grangeville, Idaho, to her grandparents' house in Lewiston, which was about a 73-mile train trip. I think it only cost 53 cents. Unlike kind of the mental image that this conjures, she was never like put into a box or anything. She just kind of rode in the train's mail compartment. I don't know how accurate this is, but it said that she was labeled as a baby chick, and stamps were pinned to her coat. When she got to Lewiston, she was hand delivered by a mail carrier to her grandparents' home. And so there were a lot of these little cute stories that made the like local interest columns in the newspapers. But however, this practice was stopped in June of 1920 by the U.S. Postal Service.
Spoil sports.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked the girl in Idaho, the 4-year-old. She ended up, living a long and full life into the late 20th century. So just sort of an interesting thing. She has her own Wikipedia page, despite that really being her only sort of claim to fame. As always, any of the articles and stuff that we've talked about today will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com in a PDF with this episode. So we're going to move now to talking about radio broadcast history. So a few years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of WVUD, the station that carries our radio program. But this year is the 100th anniversary, more or less, of commercial radio broadcasting in the United States. Now, there was a long sort of process leading up to this that involved a lot of experimentation with radios and coming up with new regulation of radios. And there was obviously, after 1920, you see the huge sort of takeoff of radio begin. But 1920 is kind of generally considered to be when these some of these experimental stations transitioned into being sort of licensed and regulated commercial broadcasting. So there was sort of an interesting couple of tie-ins to some of the World War I stuff that we were talking about earlier. So back in 1906, about 10 years before the U.S. entered World War I, there had been an International Radio Telegraph Convention. So originally, radios were considered either radio telegraphs or wireless telegraphy. The countries like Great Britain had rather impressively managed to put undersea telegraph cables almost all around the world by the early 20th century. But that also that only goes so far. It doesn't really help you if you are on a ship, for example, and can't currently plug into a wireless connection. I mean, a wired telegraph connection. So that you come up with these wireless radios, which originally were not for transmitting human voices or music or anything like that. It was just more bleeps and bloops. So, you could go do 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 like you would do on the telegraph, except it was coming in sound form, and then people would, write down the little dots and dashes and translate it and so forth. But so the International Radio Telegraph Convention in 1906 had met, and they had, come up with, like some preliminary regulations to try to come up with international standards. This was especially important because, as became pretty important in the history of radio as a whole, even to present day, radio waves do not respect national borders. So more than almost anything else where you need to have international regulations, much like air pollution or something, if you set up a big radio station next to the national border of a country, a lot of them ended up being set up on the Mexican border, for example, inside Mexico to avoid U.S. regulation, you can just sort of beam stuff over the border. And obviously during the Cold War, that was a big feature where you would have dueling propaganda broadcasts going back and forth across the Iron Curtain. Similarly, World War II, of course, there was lots of attempts to do propaganda in various languages to the enemy party's soldiers. That's obviously been a huge feature, but it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that there was going to need to be international regulation. But the most important thing was just like, if you had companies like Marconi that were sort of developing a near monopoly control on the wireless telegraphy market, it was going to be a problem if they didn't really interface with or work with any of their competitors, because then you'd have potentially ships trying to communicate with each other and not getting through because the Marconi operators were instructed that non-emergency things were supposed to be disregarded, and maybe, you then have to leave it to the individual operator to interpret whether something is an emergency. But the thing that was kind of interesting to me is this is sort of the last period where the United States is before World War I, is definitely a significant power in world politics, but not significant enough or not enough of a superpower to not be kind of bossed around by some other countries sometimes for the best. So they kind of ignored the convention regulations or suggested regulations after 1906. And there had been some preliminary sort of regulations passed through Congress, but they weren't really interested. This is kind of like a precursor to the debate in the U.S. Senate over the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. So the Wireless Ship Act of 1910 had been a pretty straightforward regulation that mandated most passenger ships exiting U.S. ports now had to carry radio equipment with qualified operators, but they still didn't really have any sort of licensing or regulation process, which caused interference issues with radio communications. But and again, this was still more of the dots and dashes rather than voice communications. But it's the Wikipedia article for Radio Act of 1912 elaborates on the problem here with the international context and the U.S. Senate. The U.S. policy of unrestricted stations differed from most of the rest of the world. The 1906 International Radio Telegraph Convention held in Berlin called for countries to license their stations, and although United States representatives had signed this agreement, initially the U.S. Senate did not ratify the treaty. However, the U.S. was told it would not be invited to the next International Radio Telegraph Convention scheduled to be held in London in June 1912 unless it completed ratification, so the U.S. Senate did finally ratify the 1906 convention after about 6 years in April of 1912 and started drafting legislation to implement it. A lot of the stuff, wasn't really regulated beyond that until basically the late 1920s, well after radio had sort of taken off in popularity. But it was interesting to see this kind of the United States still being in a position where it could be kind of pushed around or told that there were going to be consequences for its action or inaction on certain things. Now, they did adopt some early regulations regarding various wavelengths and things like that, and who was going to be able to use this and that. But the second conference in 1912, which did happen right after the Titanic sank and tried to address some of the issues that had come up during that emergency, things like people thought, oh, we're going to, radio is going to take off. The experimentation is going to take off. We're going to keep developing the technology, keep like experimenting with broadcasting and so forth. And that really got cut off pretty quickly because 2 years later, World War I breaks out. Now, the United States didn't enter until 1916, but in the sort of long run up to that, it became an increasing both security and safety concern in the United States, ultimately leading to all of the broadcasting to be shut down until the end of the war. So there's a bit of hiatus in sort of the development that happens there. But basically, they didn't want like ships getting confused or getting false orders. They didn't want, important communications getting leaked that were supposed to be secret. So everything was sort of put on a hold in terms of the experimentation. But, up until 1916, you had some people like an electrical engineer at Westinghouse and some various other sort of inventor types that were kind of fiddling around with experimenting with sort of what we would now consider to be pirate radio broadcasts from home. But, of course, they weren't pirate radio at the time because there wasn't any sort of licensing process or regulatory process in the United States, as we just talked about, unlike in other countries. But then after the war ended at the end of 1918, we see this sort of boom again in 1919 of experimenting with various broadcasts. And then ultimately in 1920, in August 1920, 100 years ago this month, we see a number of these stations sort of trying to convert from an experimental thing into a more regularized process. There's a couple of sort of competing claims as to what might be the first. There were also a lot of experiments happening in other countries at the time as well, including South America. But Westinghouse launched a station in November of 1920, the first commercially licensed radio station that was not just a commercial broadcast station, but actually had licensing approval from the U.S. government. But earlier in August 1920, there was a news radio program broadcast from 8MK, which later became WWJ in Detroit, Michigan. There was also October 1920, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as another licensed broadcast thing that was officially approved by the U.S. government. And they, in November, broadcast the presidential election results as their first show. There was also 8MK. Lee DeForest was an inventor of various radio technologies and things related to radio technologies, and he did some daily broadcasting starting in August of 1920 as well. Although again, this was something that had sort of been involved with various other companies and finance guys, like, saying, oh, I'll give some kid some money to like work on something in his garage for a while and so forth. But eventually a lot of these experimental stations became formalized as regulated and licensed broadcast stations over the course of 1920 and into 1921. Another interesting note was that in 1919, after World War I had ended, the U.S. government launched a station, WWV, in D.C. It's now in Colorado, and it still exists to this day. Today, you can, that's how radio clocks get their radio time, radio time adjustments made. They basically ping the signal or turn themselves on to get the signal and then say, okay, this is the seconds. You can also call in to a number and hear something that'll, have like a metronomic tick that, goes every second and then says, the time at the beep will be such and such. That originates out of this experimental station, which also had started in the DC area doing like tests of actual, music broadcasting and voices and things like that, which all these experimental stations had been doing in the early 1910s and the mid 1910s until the World War I caused the suspensions. But by the time we get to 1919, 1920, you now have the ability to transmit voices, but then you have the problem of you need people to have receivers in order to actually hear this. And this explodes pretty quickly in popularity over the course of 1920 as these stations launch, where people are like going out and buying radios. There was sort of a big controversy with, the music industry, I think similar to what we see today with them getting upset about various internet streaming things and precursors to streaming, piracy, illegal downloading, that sort of thing. They were convinced that this was like this thing that was going to destroy the record industry, was that, people were going to be getting a radio set, one-time purchase, and then getting all this free music, and how were they possibly going to benefit? And of course, later it turned out that you could get people introduced to music and interested in going out and buying a record if they heard something on the radio. And so eventually the industry sort of came around, but they were very resistant to it and tried to destroy the industry initially, unsuccessfully. There was some other regulations that came around. Radio Act of 1927 created the Federal Radio Commission, which was mostly tasked with very sort of technical aspects, like making sure that signals didn't interfere with each other. But there was an amendment in 1928 by a representative from Tennessee, Ewan Davis, to require a fair and equitable allocation of licenses, wavelengths, time for operation, and station power to each of the states, the District of Columbia, the territories, and possessions of the United States within each zone according to population. So then they had to come up with all these sort of equity formulas about how many stations there could be in a given area based on population and so forth. And then eventually the FCC was created to replace that agency in 1934. And there was an unsuccessful attempt during the authorization of the FCC to create a sort of carve out for a quarter of all radio stations to be nonprofit and educational or academic broadcasters supported by advertising. This was not adopted. The compromise instead was to have public affairs blocks of programming on commercial stations. And the fairness doctrine was added into some of this legislation in regulation in 1949. That's a sort of a famous one as well, though that was dropped in 1987. So that's sort of the radio broadcasting in 1920 kicks off, and then of course most of the more famous stuff about the history of radio broadcasting occurs later in the 20s and into the 30s with things like the fireside chats and all that. And you can read up a lot more in the notes that will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com. Our final topic today, Rachel, is the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. This was something that had a lot of strength in the Mountain West region where you are, and it's worth talking about the final ratification of that. And then I know, Kelley, you wanted to note some of the sort of ongoing challenges with women's, equality movements in the United States. So, Rachel, take it away.
Yeah. So the 19th Amendment was ratified and certified on August 26, 1920. People in Congress had made several attempts to pass a women's suffrage amendment starting in 1878, but these failed until it passed the House of Representatives on May 21st, 1919, followed by the Senate on June 4th, 1919. It was then submitted to the states for ratification. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee was the last of the necessary 36 states to ratify it. However, I did want to point out that, especially in the West, many states had already granted women's suffrage, and a handful of others also granted women the right to vote in presidential elections prior to the adoption of the 19th Amendment. However, in 1920, only 36% of eligible women turned out to vote, compared with 68% of men. There were several factors leading to this low turnout. There were other barriers to voting, such as literacy tests, residency requirements, and poll taxes. Also, women just didn't have experience with the voting process. There was a persistent belief that voting was inappropriate for women, which also may have led to low turnout. The participation gap was actually the smallest in swing states, states that had closer races such as Missouri and Kentucky, and states where barriers to voting were lower. However, the gap was eliminated by 1960, and women then were turning out to vote in presidential elections in greater numbers than men, and a trend of higher female voting engagement has continued to this day. So prior to the 19th Amendment being adopted, many Western states had already adopted women's suffrage, and even some territories adopted suffrage prior to statehood, such as Wyoming, Utah, Washington, Montana, and Alaska. These were states and territories where women were really integral members of the community. These were states that had strong farming and mining communities, and states where labor was very strong. And in these communities and labor movements, women had a voice and could reach positions of power. So it was kind of a natural extension to give them the right to vote in elections. Wyoming was the first territory to grant full voting rights to women in 1869, and then it was also the first state to grant women full voting rights in 1890. I did want to point out that Idaho granted women's suffrage in 1896 in a referendum. All three of the major political parties at the time, the Democrats, the Republicans, and also the Populist Party, endorsed women's suffrage. And also there was a big movement in the labor movement, and also Mormons were pretty strong in getting women's suffrage to pass. And in Idaho, it passed by a 2-to-1 margin, which is pretty impressive. I did want to point out the Mormon connection for like Idaho and Utah and other Western states. Women had the right to vote in church assemblies. So they did have a voice in the church, but by no means was there ideas of full equality between men and women in the Mormon church, but they were allowed a voice. So I thought that was fairly interesting and a fairly Western phenomenon at the time. However, Black women and other minorities were involved in the suffrage movement in the West, but Native American women were kind of kept out of that movement. They weren't full citizens, and to be allowed to vote, many Native Americans had to renounce their connection to their tribe. And even after the 19th Amendment was ratified, a lot of Native American women were still not allowed to vote in various states. In 1924, Zikala Sa, a Lakota writer and activist, lobbied Congress to secure suffrage for Indigenous Americans. As a result of her efforts, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which defined Native Americans as U.S. citizens. But however, even after the passage of this law, many Western states continued to disenfranchise Indigenous people. Black people were also kept from the polls, oftentimes due to those things like the poll taxes and literacy tests. So we kind of have to wrestle with the legacy of the women's suffrage movement, which was at least in the East especially, a very white movement, and Black women's suffrage is kind of seen as more of a racial issue than a gender issue. So while women's suffrage was huge for women in 1920, it wasn't huge for all women in the United States. And I think we need to really grapple with that legacy. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, Congress had to kind of change their priorities and change how they voted. Social programs got a lot more traction because Congress was kind of afraid of a women's voting bloc being united and voting people out if they didn't agree with how these Congress people voted. Local public health spending increased. Child mortality declined somewhere between 8 and 15%, which is the equivalent of 20,000 deaths a year. Women's suffrage increased education budget, which caused children to stay in school longer, particularly children who attended underfunded schools. And spending increased for social programs and charities. Also, spending just increased in general because Congress saw that they had to appeal to larger demographics. They couldn't just kind of pass laws that benefited white males and didn't really concern themselves with other people in the country. A big bill that passed in 1921 was the Shepard-Towner Act, which provided funding for programs that helped mothers and infants. And it passed by a vote of 279 to 39. So at least in the early years after women's suffrage passed, there was that, catering, I guess, not really, but Congress saw that they had to appeal to a wider group of people. However, this kind of gap between the genders, that kind of disappeared, and the voting kind of went back towards less social spending until the New Deal.
All right, Kelley, your closing thoughts as we're finishing out our time today?
Sure. I think just like it's important to remember Wilson's racist legacy hand in hand with the League of Nations, it's also important to just remember, as Rachel called attention to, the racist legacy of the suffrage movement and how that very much still impacts us today. The feminist movement still is not as big as a tent as it needs to be. And so it's worth recalling its roots in what's happened in the past 100 years.
Yeah, I think one of the big sort of topics of discourse these days with regard to feminism, especially in the United States, but also other places, is the focus on ordinary women, so to speak, and their liberation and creating a new society that's better for everyone, not just women, but, through the process of liberating women, or is the goal to have more women presidents and more women CEOs and stuff like that, which is definitely a goal of some feminists, but not all. All right, Kelley, thank you so much for being on the show this week.
Thanks for having me.
And Rachel, thank you for being on as well.
Thanks, Bill.